Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin von Hippel, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the joint RUSI IRC event on Syria. I think, as we all know, we're heading into the 7th year of a really, truly catastrophic civil war, one that just seems to get worse every year. I worked on Syria at the start of the conflict for the State Department, and Ambassador Ford used to say back in 2012, it's going to get worse before it gets worse. And unfortunately, he was right. We've had over 500,000 killed, half of the population of the country, 10 million people have been displaced. And it's a tragedy that has not just impacted Syria and its neighbors, but of course, a spillover effect has hit across the world. We all remember the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, when thousands of refugees were streaming across Europe. It was a little bit unrealistic to expect the neighboring countries to hold that many million refugees in those countries in perpetuity. And so the dams burst and people just started streaming across Europe. We saw ISIL metastasizing and growing in Syria because of the lack of a resolution of the conflict. And of course, attacks were carried out in Europe and elsewhere. They were planned from Syria. So there were enormous spillover effects from pretty much a policy of by the international community of really not focusing on ending it as robustly as perhaps they could have. So really the lesson for all of us on this, I think, is that we ignore these conflicts at our peril because they do impact everybody. And many could argue that the ramifications were exploited by populist politicians in Europe and North America, leading to the elections of some right-wing extremist politicians, as well as potentially Brexit and even Donald Trump in the United States. So the ramifications have been enormous. Now, if you look at policy on Syria today, I think I'd be hard-pressed to say what the U.S. policy is today and even what the U.K. policy is today. We've seen it veer in a number of directions. By the end of the Obama administration, it was really about containing ISIL and eliminating ISIL, but less about the conflict. And then, of course, Trump really had continued that policy. Today, he's now much more focused on the threat that Iran can play in Syria and the region once the so-called caliphate is eliminated, although it's not clear what the U.S. policy is. We saw, there were, as we all remember, in April, 59 Tomahawk missiles hit an airbase near Homs, but that wasn't followed by any meaningful diplomatic push to end the conflict. So it was really just a one-off event. So we don't really know what the policy is. I think the true tragedy for many of us is that if you look at the efforts to solve the crisis, the U.S. and the U.K. and other countries that were leading the peace process have really ceded that leadership to Russia and Iran. And I'm not sure if that's a place that we're all comfortable with. So today, we're very lucky to have 5 expert speakers join us to explore this, the many facets of this conflict in greater detail. We have about an hour and a half, and so each speaker is going to keep it as short as possible so we can have questions from the audience. I see some Syria experts here too, and I would like to give a voice to all of you. So let me just briefly introduce each speaker. I think you should have the bios of everyone here, so I'll just briefly go through David Miliband, who all of you know, the former Foreign Secretary, but he's currently the CEO and President of IRC, one of the best humanitarian and development NGOs that worries about displaced people. Before he was Foreign Secretary, from 2007 to 2010. Before that, he was Secretary of State for the Environment, Minister of Schools, and head of Downing Street's number 10 policy unit. Lyse Doucet, another person I don't think needs any introduction, who's a really brave and award-winning BBC journalist who's been in the region for decades and has been covering all these conflicts in the region from the front lines. She was just recently in Syria, and she'll share some of her thoughts on that trip. Lina, Khatib, who runs the Middle East program at Chatham House, our cousin think tank down the road, and she formerly directed the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. They do fantastic work, as we all know. And her focus is on issues such as just general international relations in the Middle East, Islamist groups, security issues in the region, the Syrian conflict, and political transitions. And we have Dr. Yasmine Nahlawi next to me. She's a research and policy coordinator for Rethink, Rebuild Society, and she has focused on a number of aspects of the Syria conflict, including the responsibilities to protect issues, self-determination, forcible displacement, and chemical weapons use. And you will see an empty seat over on the right, and that is, if she can make it, Alison McGovern MP, who is the co-chair of the Friends of Syria All-Party Parliamentary Group. She does that alongside Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell. She's been a member of Parliament for Wales South since May 2010. She's voting now, so we're hoping she gets here at 4:30. I'm sure you're having flashbacks, David, about that. So if she joins us, she will speak at the very end. So very quickly, if there is any issues about fire, RUSI staff will lead you to the fire exits. It's all on the record today. So I think that is all I have to say. Yeah, that's all I have to say. David, over to you first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin. Thank you very much to all of the team at RUSI for putting this together, and thank you to all 5 of these tremendous women who I'm on the platform with. I would like to say I don't feel outnumbered, but I feel lifted up by the expertise and the experience that is on the panel here. I really want to thank Karin in particular individually, but also thank the RUSI team, because I think there is a danger that Syria is going to become a forgotten crisis. And it's not that we haven't got many other things on our plate. I've just come back from northeast Nigeria. I've just flown in this morning from northeast Nigeria. We've got Yemen and conflict raging. There's the Rakhine nightmare, and now spilling into Bangladesh. As a humanitarian aid agency, we've got more than our hands full. But I owe it to the 1,000 staff that we have working inside Syria and the 1,000 working in the neighboring countries to try to make sure that in countries like this, capitals like this that really matter, Syria doesn't become the forgotten conflict. My fear is that, frankly, the Syria crisis will become a poster child for 21st century war, a poster child of the failure of international diplomacy, a poster child and a precedent for the refusal of belligerent parties in war to adhere to international humanitarian law, and a poster child for the, I hesitate to say this, but there's been huge heroism in the humanitarian effort, and the achievements of not just the people who work for the IRC, but all of the NGOs, extraordinary scenes of UN valor. But together, we have failed the people of Syria, both inside Syria and outside, from humanitarian terms as well as political terms. And it's for that reason, amongst others, that I think we owe it to the people of that benighted country to continue to remain interested. The title of the session is What Happens Next, or What Next? And speaking for the 1,000 staff and what they see every day, I can only confidently predict 2 things, or can only say 2 things about what's happening next. One is that the war is not over. The conflict is going on. September, according to our UN figures, September was the most violent month since the fall of Aleppo in 2016. 200,000 people displaced from Mayadeen over the last few weeks. 400,000 trapped in eastern Ghouta today. There are grave fears in the northwest of the country. I'm not going to speak in any detail about where we are working, but there are grave fears in the northwest of the country of rebel-on-rebel violence. And obviously those in so-called, quote-unquote, de-escalation zones, the zones that are being highlighted by, or targeted is an unfortunate word to use in this context, but those that are being listed by the Astana process, the fear of people living there, in our experience, is that they are going to be the next subjects of bombing. And that's on the basis of real experience. It's not that there hasn't been a de-escalation. It's not that there hasn't been a reduction in the amount of violence in the de-escalation zones, but the violence remains at supernormal levels despite that. So the first thing that's going to happen next, I'm afraid, is that the conflict is going to continue, albeit in a much more complex form in different parts of the country with different actors. I haven't even mentioned the very, very significant issue of Turkey's military engagement in the country, how it sees its role going forward, both in the northwest and in and around Raqqa. The second thing that I think is important to pick up, even from Karin's opening, even though it probably isn't going to be the main focus of tonight, the pressure on the refugee-hosting states, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and to a much smaller extent Iraq, which has 250,000 refugees from Syria. The pressure on those refugee-hosting states remains intense, and I'm sorry to report to you that the pressure on the refugees themselves is growing. There are well-founded reports of a small number of people being forcibly returned to Syria. There are undoubted cases of significant pressure on the refugee populations beyond the almost natural strain and stress and impoverishment of 6 or 7 years of war. And from the people that we talk to, the hundreds of thousands of refugees who we deal with every month, we see absolutely no confidence that return is an option at the moment for them. So those are two things that I sadly think are going to happen next. What are the priorities going forward? From where we sit, the following four items will be part of the long-term future as well as the short-term future, but they are about short-term gain. The first relates to the conduct of the war itself. I don't know how many of you followed the reporting out of New York last night, the Russian veto of the renewal of the joint implementation mechanism. That's obviously a telling and deeply worrying sign that while there was some evidence or suggestion that the world had come together in respect of the chemical weapons attacks, there remains deep division in the UN Security Council about that aspect of the conduct of the war. I have to report to you the targeting of medical facilities carries on. There were an ambulance supported by the RUSI just the month before last was targeted in the midst of its work. The targeting of civilians obviously remains a significant tactic of war. And as I look at warfare being conducted in Yemen and elsewhere, I see the Syria precedent and its awful consequences, the lack of accountability and the increasing sense that anything goes. And I think that could make people think, well, the past has been sold, it's been lost. I think that would be a terrible outcome. I think we have to continue to say that the conduct of the war itself remains a matter of international concern. Secondly, the issue of humanitarian access and relief. I always think all of the NGOs, all of us talk about humanitarian access, but actually that doesn't really capture what's going on. What we've got is a humanitarian strangulation going on. Access, when we say, oh, we are finding it difficult to have access, that makes it seem like it's almost a sort of, it's a mountainous terrain, it's hard to get in. There is a strangulation that is going on around the country in besieged areas, in significantly deprived areas. And I think that that is only harboring huge difficulty for the future. The third thing that I just want to put on the table that I hope we can discuss, because Karin, you're right, this is an extremely impressive audience, and I'm really grateful for people for turning up, is that those of us who believe in international diplomacy have to admit that three countries coming together with the state of Syria, well, it is more than one country, the Astana process, but by no means is it the kind of pluralistic, multilateral process that many of us look to resolve conflicts like this. And I think it must be central to anyone thinking about the future of international relations to see a situation where the UN has been so comprehensively, the UN system has been so comprehensively marginalized in the conduct of diplomacy. And Astana, we can go back over the history. Astana in some ways has filled a void, but that is not a tenable long-term process for Russia and Iran and Turkey to be the only players, the only people sitting at the table. I think is a recipe for long-term instability, but is also a denial of the basic aspects of the way the international system should work. And the fourth and final thing that I just want to mention is the most difficult and has been the biggest hole in Western policy since the beginning of the conflict. And that is what a political settlement means. It seems to me it's all very well being specific about what you want to transition from. What there's been a chronic lack of is clarity about what there is a transition to. And this syndrome of a failure to specify a political outcome and for military means to be used as an alternative is a recipe which has been tried before and does not work. We have had to send humanitarian aid workers back into Fallujah 3 times after it's taken, lost, because there isn't a legitimate and credible sharing of power. When I look at the work that we do in 3,000 Afghan villages, it's the same story. There isn't the long-term, legitimate and credible sharing of power that allows communities to live in peace. I've just come back from Nigeria. I was in Nigeria last night for 3 or 4 days. And the same issue of what is the political frame within which security operations, development operations, humanitarian operations take place remains absolutely paramount. And I think that the further that idea of a political settlement goes, the more important is that we continue to talk about it. Because the idea that states are pacified or rebel groups are beaten in a kind of whack-a-mole approach is not right. The great diplomat Richard Holbrooke warned shortly before he died about the militarization of diplomacy, which is a really telling phrase. And I think it's apposite in a body like this to reinforce that point. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. And you can look no further than across the pond for militarization of diplomacy. Alison, welcome. We'll get to you at the end, okay? So, Lyse, over to you. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, David. Thank you to all of you for coming out today and for underlining, at least in this corner, that Syria is definitely not forgotten. I want to begin by saying that no one among us gathered here today, most of all Syrians, would want to be where we are today as Syria approaches its 7th year. A country utterly shattered, a social fabric shredded, peaceful protests that evolved into a major civil war, a massive human exodus, and a playing field for extremist forces. I think nobody can say that they expected this war to last so long and to cost so much. So I feel that Syria, in my humble journalist opinion, is a cautionary tale, and that any discussion of the so-called what's next has to be mindful that the last 6 to 7 years have been one in which we, so many of us on all sides, failed to properly understand the situation and even more to respond effectively to what has gone on before. So here we are in this, as we approach the 7th year, to use the British expression, we are where we are, as tragic as that is. And so as a journalist, I will just sketch out with some broad sweeps what the situation appears to be on the ground, even, dare I say, trying to look for some facts. And we'll pick up on some of the points that David made, and I'm sure that some of the other esteemed panelists will either fill in the gaps, change, or correct what I will say. Let me begin with Damascus, which is a capital I visited last month. It happened to be during the time of the first international trade fair held since the uprising began. It was a very glittering symbol, a message from the government of President Bashar al-Assad that the war is now over. Ever since, as they see it, the government has now taken back, since the last battles for Aleppo, taken back all the major cities. Never mind that every night in Damascus we could hear the neighborhood of Jobar being pounded by government warplanes. So I put it to one of the Syrian businessmen at one of the stands. I said, you hear the fighting, you can hear the gunfire in Jobar from here, you can hear the warplanes. Is the war really over? He said, it's almost over, just a half an hour to go. And then I went a few shops down and I saw another Syrian businessman and I said, really? Do you think the war is over? He goes, yeah, it's almost over, just 1 minute to go. So whether it's half an hour or 1 minute or many years, and it should be said that a few days after that, a mortar slammed into the entrance of the trade fair, sending a message from the opposition, and at least 6 people were killed. But it has to be pointed out, the Syrians have always loved their international trade fair. It was packed every night. If you didn't know much about Syrian history, you wouldn't have thought that this was a country which was had a punishing war, which has had a huge impact on the economy. There were a wide range of countries, of course, those that have a relationship with the government, who had come to Damascus to exhibit their wares, and not surprisingly, the Iranians and the Russians had the biggest pavilions of all. So the message about the future from President Assad is that it will be the friends of the Syrian government who will benefit, who will take part in the next phase. Some call it reconstruction. It's a very politically loaded word. Let us use the word rebuilding. So in Damascus, there was talk of oil deal for the Russians, infrastructure for the Chinese, heavy industry for the Iranians. Do they have the money, the interests, the wherewithal to carry out that kind of infrastructure? We're not sure. And I was told this week that Russian officials keep saying in a sort of an offhanded way, well, oh, the EU will do this and the EU will do that. Well, that is actually the gamble for the EU right now, and some of you may have heard of it, that Federica Mogherini over the past year has begun to discuss how the European Union wants to become more involved and wants to use this possibility of reconstruction funds, dangle it in front of the government and saying, we have the funds, we want to be part of rebuilding Syria, but there is one big condition: no money unless there is a clear political process, in other words, a political transition. The game now seems to be for the EU and the UN, what they say in private, is that they are hoping to get Russia on board to make this happen, to push forward the political process. And even the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, who also want to be part of what is, as always it's too early to say a post-war situation, but when the day comes, if it ever comes, the bonanza for rebuilding, they talk of separating Russia from Iran in order to try to put pressure on President Assad's government. As for the Iranians, they are absolutely scathing about this EU plan, notwithstanding their quite good relations with the EU after the Iran nuclear deal. They say that aid cannot be a bargaining chip. So it is hard, if that is the main focus of the EU, one of the major players, if that's the main approach to Syria's future, it's hard to say right now with any certainty that it will work. And there's one big reason why. And that is for the last 5 years, ever since there was talk of a UN-brokered political solution, a negotiated way out of the war, I have never heard a single government official in Damascus speak with anything but contempt about the main political opposition. And I've never heard them discuss the Syrian opposition groups, even the mainstream groups, as anything but terrorists. And we have reached a position, and Karin is saying that we don't really know what the Western policy is, including the US and Britain and France, but it is clearly shifting as the war drags on. They still insist that there can be no sustainable future for Syria unless there is a change in leadership. But the question is the one which has been the same question since the beginning: how will this change in leadership come about? Even the UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has recently, only once, mentioned the phrase that is used by the Russians, the Iranians, the supporters of the government, and that is, it is up to the Syrians and not the outside players to decide. Even Staffan de Mistura is now talking about elections, and that too is controversial. Can you really hold elections in Syria now? When I was in Damascus, an editor of a pro-government newspaper sketched it out this way, and for better or worse, this is the view in Damascus, and whether we like it or not. Next presidential elections in 2021, some so-called opposition will be allowed to take part. There will be some so-called changes, minor changes to the constitution, and there will be what will be called a so-called national unity government. That is just one prediction, but it is the one that seems to be emerging from Damascus. Backers of the Syrian opposition, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are now talking in private about what they call broadening the opposition, strengthening the opposition as we approach this next phase. And not surprisingly, the rivalry with Qatar, which has plagued efforts to support the opposition since the beginning, is now an even greater factor. So in private, there is talk of replacing Riyad Hajjab, who has, many believe, done a very effective job as the head of the High Negotiations Committee. But some Gulf officials now say he's too close to Qatar and he has to go. And the Saudis also spoke, and they made this very clear to the opposition the last time they mentioned in Riyadh, there is, to use the euphemism, new political realities. In other words, President Assad is still in power and he's not about to leave any time soon. Staffan de Mistura has used the same phrase, and not surprisingly, the opposition has reacted with anger and bitterness, accusing their supporters of betrayal. How will it all play out? Well, back to my first point, is that Syria has been and will remain an unpredictable place. Things have happened that nobody expected. Perhaps more things will happen that nobody expected. But I've tried to sketch out what it looks like on the ground when you go to Syria and in a place where Syria lies in ruin, but the government forces are back at least in control of the main cities. Just a few comments on the way forward. What we have seen is, I think there has been a clear trend on the ground in the military situation in battle after battle, and we all know how ferocious the battles have been and the humanitarian price. But they have all more or less ended in a negotiated end. The government calls it reconciliation. The opposition sees it as surrender. Humanitarian actors see it as the culmination of a brutal tactic, and David mentioned it, called surrender or starve, the combination of bombardment and starvation, which puts families, put pressure on the fighters, who then have no choice but to leave, and in most cases to go ahead to another place to fight another day. And we've now reached the point that most of them are now trapped in Idlib. Now these kind of deals, which the government has always mentioned as the way forward, they have never seen a way forward, if the truth be told, in Geneva or in New York. They have been embedded in what David has referred to as the Astana process, which is essentially the process of Russia and Iran, President Assad's main backers, and Turkey, a rebel backer, getting together. It is a thinly veiled attempt to get a political solution in the guise of a military solution, which is why Staffan de Mistura made sure that he was there from day one, to ensure that this did not veer from the Geneva track, to make sure that it was a parallel track and not a competing track. But it has to be said, it is the Astana process which has come up, again for better or worse, the only thing which are these agreements. David mentioned some of them. Let me just point to them four in detail, since we may want to discuss with them. 4 de-escalation zones were agreed last May. Idlib and some of the surrounding areas, the governorate as well as the city, home to about 1 million people, controlled by the opposition. It is the hardline Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a group which is largely dominated by al-Qaeda's former Syrian affiliate, which is dominating it. The East Ghouta suburb of Damascus, again, David mentioned that, home to hundreds of thousands of people. Hardline Jaish al-Islam is said to be one of the main groups, and there's the presence of so-called Islamic State in some adjoining neighborhoods. Southwest Syria, along the Jordanian border, where it's the one place where there is a continuing presence of the mainstream Free Syrian Army. And the 4th de-escalation zone is northern parts of Homs province, which has a range of rebel groups, including some linked to al-Qaeda. So they're called de-escalation zones, although in some there has been no de-escalation. But they are, in a very real sense, in a realpolitik sense, and to use the mildest phrase, zones of influence. And the fear, of course, is that the zones of influence will not be temporary, and the question is, how long will they continue to be? Turkey in northwest Syria, Jordan and the United States in the south. Russia has put its military police on the checkpoints around East Ghouta, and of course, Iran exercises influence wherever it can. Let me just point to some key questions about what next in looking at some of those de-escalation zones. Idlib. Will there be more war, more deals by outside powers, or more of both? And now in Idlib, there is no de-escalation. David mentioned it. It is now being seen that the most vicious fighting since the fall of Aleppo is now happening in Idlib. The ICRC has repeatedly raised concern that yet again, hospitals, schools, civilian infrastructure are being targeted. Enter Turkey. In early October, the Turkish army began what it called a reconnaissance mission, ostensibly to set up this de-escalation zone. It is working with Turkish supporting rebels. There is now a Turkish Free Syrian Army. It even has a Wikipedia page, TFSA. Their job is not just to set up the de-escalation zone, but to try to push out the hardline groups that are on Turkey's border. As President Erdogan says, we have learned that if we don't go to Syria, Syria will come to us. In other words, the kind of attacks that Turkey has seen from extremist groups. Will there be new battles? This is unclear. Many believe that neither the hardline Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or the Turkish army and its allies want to have new battles, that there may be a deal of some kind along the lines of the one that we saw as the battles came to an end in Aleppo, a deal largely negotiated by outside powers, Russia and Turkey, so that Turkey would persuade the rebel groups to leave that area, and in exchange, Russia would acquiesce and give Turkey the ability to focus on what is Turkey's main goal, which is to deprive Syrian Kurds of a corridor and to deprive them of self-rule along northern Syria, along its border. A reminder, if one was needed, that in all of these zones of influence, different countries have different agendas, and often they're not primarily to do with Syria. Secondly, southern Syria. The de-escalation zone there was the result of negotiations between Russia, Jordan, and the United States. It was taken out of the Astana process because the de-escalation zone there is not just to keep Jordan's border peaceful, not just to keep the government away, it's also to keep Iran away. So they didn't want Iran, which is part of Astana, to be part of the negotiations. So far, it is holding, and it is being seen as a rare example of a U.S. policy success. But, as Karin mentioned, the U.S. has signaled that they are now going to stop the arming of Syrian opposition groups, even the mainstream Free Syrian Army. They're going to stop paying the salaries. So the big concern now is what will happen to the de-escalation zone in southern Syria, in the area around Dera, the area close to, and also in Kenetra, because there will be no one to pay the fighters, and who will be the next paymasters for the fighters. So that, unfortunately, could unravel. Southern Damascus, there was an tentative agreement signed in Egypt this month. Egypt also wants to become involved, whereby it's been concluded with the main rebel groups and Russia as well. Even the rebel groups are now looking to Russia as their guarantor, as what they hope will be the key to a different kind of future in Syria. The regime was not part of those discussions in Cairo. The rebels say they want humanitarian aid to enter East Ghouta. There's now horrible reports, and I'm sure you've seen them, of starvation in Ghouta, grave concern about the situation there. They also want to make sure there is none of the forced displacement, sometimes described as ethnic cleansing, that we have seen in other negotiated withdrawals in other parts of Syria. But that will be a big question mark. So to conclude, I'm not going to look at Islamic State because I know Lina's going to look at that. A lot of very, very important questions about how the future in Syria will play out in political, military, economic, and social terms. The view from Damascus is very different from the view in many other capitals, but there's beginning to be a convergence that the facts on the ground are such that will complicate the way forward, as David says, and sadly for the people of Syria means that there will not be a resolution anytime soon. A lot of areas are quieter, so fewer people are dying, but in order for them to live what could be called a life, they need to have aid and economic support, and that, as we've known in Syria, that's very complicated indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyse. We are trying to focus on a way forward, but I think we have to understand also the complexities of what's happening on the ground first. So, Yasmine, over to you. I think we're going to hear a bit about accountability and international law from you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Karin, and thank you all for being here. My background is in international law as a researcher, but also in policy through my role at Rethink Rebuild Society. So what I want to do today is to bridge my two backgrounds and to talk about the mechanisms that exist under international law that the international community could have taken with respect to Syria, and to link that to policy demands of Syrian civil society here in the UK. But there's no reason why it has to be constrained to the UK. This can apply to any other country in the world. Now, since day one, we've been told that international action on Syria is practically impossible because of the Russian and Chinese vetoes. For me, however, it's inconceivable to say that a mass atrocity situation such as the one happening in Syria can simply be brushed aside because of the abuse of a systematic power which exists in the form of a veto. And what I want to emphasize today is that international law is actually quite versatile. And there are options both within the UN and also outside the UN that individual states could have taken, or that other international or regional organizations could have taken to induce compliance with international norms and to resolve the situation. So before I start, I just want to give a word of caution that it will be a very general overview just because of the time constraints, but I'll be happy to go into further detail in the Q&A session or in person later on. The first mechanism that I want to draw attention to is the Uniting for Peace mechanism. So this exists within the context of the United Nations. Uniting for Peace was established in 1950 in response to persistent Soviet vetoes with respect to the situation in Korea. And basically what Uniting for Peace does is it allows for a situation to be transferred from the Security Council to the General Assembly following either a procedural vote within the Security Council, so that requires 9 votes within the Security Council out of 15, and the veto does not exist here, or through a majority vote within the General Assembly. If a situation is referred from the Security Council over to the General Assembly can then make recommendations through a 2/3 majority vote for states to adopt. And these recommendations can include non-military measures, but equally, although more controversially, it can also include the use of force. So to bring this to the context in Syria. In Syria, we've had 9 vetoes thus far by Russia and or China. And as David mentioned, the most recent one was just yesterday. The veto is obviously hindering the Security Council's ability to effectively address the situation. And the most obvious evidence of that is the continued mass atrocity situation, but also that existing Security Council resolutions, are not implemented. As we can see with the resolutions on chemical weapons use, on barrel bombs, on humanitarian access, and more. So in this context, the Uniting for Peace mechanism represents a very compelling opportunity to be taken through the UN to induce international action by overcoming the Security Council veto. And here, I guess the options are pretty much open-ended in terms of what the General Assembly can recommend should such a referral take place. And looking at the draft resolutions that were vetoed by Russia and China, some of the options that come to the forefront include establishing enforceable mechanisms to enforce the prohibition against chemical weapons, barrel bombs, and so on, to take steps towards the achievement of ceasefires. So for example, one of Russia's vetoes in December of last year was against the establishment of a ceasefire for East Aleppo, to pass sanctions or travel bans associated with individuals or entities that do not comply or that help the state in non-compliance with existing measures or existing Security Council resolutions on chemical weapons, designating groups that attack civilians, including pro-regime militias as terrorist entities, or, for example, in establishing justice systems in non-state controlled areas. So these are all examples that could have been taken through the Uniting for Peace mechanism, although, as I mentioned, the option is pretty much open-ended. So that's through the United Nations, the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And now I want to turn to another option that states have outside the United Nations. And here I want to talk about third-party countermeasures. Now, a countermeasure is essentially the non-performance of a legal obligation by one state in order to induce another state to comply with its international obligations. Now, with respect to injured states, so if a state is injured, it has the right under international law to conduct countermeasures against the state that is committing that internationally wrongful act. With respect to third-party states, so for example, a state that is not directly injured or not even a party to a certain situation, the right to engage in third-party countermeasures has gained much more traction in international law, specifically with respect to norms that are what are called owed to the international community as a whole. So there are some rights that states owe on a bilateral basis, but there are some rights that are owed to the wider international community, and human rights norms represent such obligations. So each individual state owes this obligation to every other state in the international community. There are limitations to the use of countermeasures, including no use of force. They must be proportional. They can't violate human rights norms or international humanitarian law. They can't violate peremptory norms of international law. But also, equally compellingly, they represent options that individual states or regional or international organizations could have taken to address the abuses going on in Syria. And I want to give two examples here. One example in which third-party countermeasures were employed in Syria, and then I want to talk about one case where they should have been, or they still should be or can be employed with respect to the conflict. So one example of third-party countermeasures that were employed in Syria can be seen in the actions taken by the League of Arab States. In 2011, the League of Arab States adopted economic sanctions, and it also suspended Syria's seat from the body. And both actions were in clear violation of the League's own internal pact and policies and procedures. So that's an example of the League of Arab States violating its own obligations in order to induce compliance by Syria to uphold its international obligations owed to the international community as a whole. Sorry. The second example, which I want to move to, is the example of what can the international community do now, and this pertains to humanitarian access. So there are existing Security Council mandates, as was mentioned earlier, that compel or obligate the Syrian state to provide unfettered humanitarian access to UN humanitarian aid agencies, as well as their implementing partners. But we also all know that this has not happened whatsoever. And the pictures that we've seen this week from Eastern Ghouta, where 350,000 to 400,000 civilians are starving under siege now, illustrate that these Security Council resolutions are not being implemented. So, as a means of inducing compliance by the Assad regime to these Security Council resolutions, one policy option that has been advocated by Syrian civil society is to conduct humanitarian aid drops into besieged areas. So here, individual states or regional organizations or whatever entity you have can conduct aid drops into besieged areas as a means of inducing compliance by the Assad regime to allow open and unfettered humanitarian access. It's a very compelling situation right now, and given Siege Watch's report last month that over 800,000 civilians are still under siege in Syria, and it's doable, it's realistic, it's something that the international community, the UK and other states should look at implementing. But even more broadly, third-party countermeasures represent also a very practical step that states can do in order to induce compliance by Syria. So I'll leave it at that. I guess the basic point that I wanted to drive through today was that even if we do have the Security Council vetoes by Russia and China, that doesn't mean we're out of options. There are options that individual states can take, there are options that regional and international organizations can take, and there are even steps that can be taken through the United Nations. Thank you.
Lina, over to you. You spent time in the region and now here, so you'll different perspective. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure how different. I just want to say that at Chatham House, I'm running a large-scale project on Syria called Syria from Within. And the project brings together a really large number of Syrian experts from all kinds of different backgrounds, to focus on what's happening on the ground inside Syria. You can, if you're interested, go to the website, which is syria.chathamhouse.org, and read the weekly analysis that we produce. Today, we just published a piece on Raqqa and the Raqqa Council, which is the initiative set up to govern Raqqa post the taking back of the governorate from ISIS. What I want to talk about is also built on my recent trip to Washington. I was there last week. The conversation there very much echoes what Lyse has said. And one thing that is being debated at the moment is that if the Assad regime is indeed going to be in place for the next 3 years until elections happen in 2021, then what the US and Russia can work on in the meantime is the conditions related to the electoral processes and conditions to do with candidate eligibility, and try through that to find some space for maneuver so that by the time the elections happen in 2021, the political landscape might look a little different. How successful they will be, of course, is a whole other story. The other issue that I want to comment on, which I think is very important, is again building on what Lyse mentioned, the issue of reconstruction, or whether you want to call it rebuilding. The debate now, as you heard, is whether the international community, generally speaking, in the West, mainly the EU, can actually use reconstruction as leverage with the Syrian regime. Looking at what's happening inside Syria with the dynamics with Russia and Iran, one thing we have to remember is that neither Russia nor Iran is interested in funding reconstruction in Syria. They are interested in benefiting from reconstruction in Syria. And, crucially, neither those two entities nor the regime is interested in reconstructing the whole of Syria. I think the danger when we say reconstruction in Syria is this image that comes to mind of areas such as eastern Aleppo, areas that had been under rebel control that the regime has now destroyed or taken back after destroying, that eventually these areas are going to be rebuilt. My information shows me that actually the regime is only interested in supplying resources to loyalist areas and not to these areas that have been destroyed in the conflict. This is for a number of reasons. One is because resources are limited for the regime, but the more important reason is that the regime wants to, first of all, reward the supporters in loyalist areas, and second of all, punish those people in areas that had rebelled against the Syrian regime led by Assad. At the same time, if you think about how these areas look like today, a lot of them are areas that have been largely emptied of their original residents who have ended up as refugees in places like Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, and some of them, of course, in Europe. It is in the regime's interest for these areas to be as empty of residents as possible, because it's much easier to control areas if they have few people living there. This means that for those people concerned about the continuation of the refugee crisis, the reality is that the regime is simply not interested in bringing these refugees back. It actually wants to keep them out. What makes the situation more complicated is that in a place like Lebanon, lots of different political leaders in the country are also benefiting from the existence of Syrian refugees there, because a lot of the money coming from foreign sources that is meant to go to support the refugee situation, whether the refugees themselves or their Lebanese host communities, this money is being actually stolen by a large spectrum of political/economic entities in Lebanon. So again, it is in the interest of these entities for the refugees to remain so that they can continue to benefit. So if the regime is benefiting from having the refugees out and these entities are also benefiting, and let's not forget that Turkey also benefits from having refugees on its soil because it can use them as a bargaining chip with Europe. This means that the refugee crisis is going to be with us for as long as the regime in Syria of Bashar al-Assad is going to be with us. The other thing that the regime is doing is, as you know, there are now sanctions, of course, on the regime, but the regime still gets money from foreign entities in the form of humanitarian aid flowing to ministries such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Social Affairs in Syria. And what is happening is that the regime is managing to use this money to again reward loyalists who have now set up so-called NGOs that are being registered by the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs so that they are eligible for funding coming through the ministry. Of course, there are genuine civil society organizations in regime and non-regime areas in Syria, but you see the regime is doing this as a mechanism to reward loyalists while presenting to the outside world an image of opening up in which all of a sudden NGOs are allowed to exist in regime-held areas and using that to kind of present the regime in a positive light. The other thing that is happening is that it's not just regime loyalists who are setting up NGOs, it's also militias that are fighting alongside the regime that are also setting up charities. And these charities are used to both keep the communities in regime loyalist areas kind of satisfied, because these militias obviously have amongst their ranks members of the Alawi community and the Sunni community in regime areas that have sometimes, of course, lost their lives in conflict. And so there are lots of families of martyrs that kind of have needs that kind of these charities are trying to meet. But at the same time, the charities are a way also to get funding from the same sources that I spoke about, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that means that the regime continuation, which many regard as at least providing a degree of stability in Syria, harbors within it very problematic dynamics that will mean the continuation of militias in regime areas and the lack of equitable distribution of resources. And if you think at the roots of the Syrian conflict and why it happened in the first place, grievances played a huge role in why people were protesting. So we're not really solving any problem by having the same political economic elites that had been funneling most of Syria's resources towards themselves and their supporters before 2011 essentially refurbish themselves and play a role in the new kind of era of supposed reconstruction. And let's not forget that a lot of these entities have already also started setting up private companies as another way to allow the regime to get around sanctions and also to position themselves at the forefront whenever the procurement process happens for reconstruction contracts to be negotiated. And Russia, of course, sees itself as the main broker in this. And sadly, a lot of business people from across the Arab world and elsewhere are now starting to visit Moscow so that they can also get a share of the pie. When we talk about continuing grievances, this has to bring us to the discussion about ISIS, because, of course, ISIS also came about as a result of grievances more than anything else. The political, social, and economic grievances that exist in Syria and Iraq have been a key driver for people who have basically embraced entities like ISIS. Now we have seen Raqqa largely liberated from ISIS, and this is being presented in very positive terms. Of course, this is a military defeat for ISIS and also crucially a symbolic one, because it means the end of the physical caliphate for this terrorist organization, which is a good thing. But it's not the end of the story. One thing that, of course, people in the West are worried about is the issue of foreign fighters. And some are wondering, where are these foreign fighters and how come we haven't seen them come back? Well, the issue is, if you're a foreign fighter within ISIS in Syria and Iraq, why would you come back and be arrested by your home government? You're not going to come back. You actually have nowhere to go. And the fighters have gone in mainly two directions. One is in the direction of Al-Bukamal and Mayadin, which are two cities in Deir ez-Zor, neighboring Raqqa Governorate, where ISIS still has a strong presence. The other direction in which they have gone in is the desert between Syria and Iraq, which is where ISIS leaders have operated from the very beginning. ISIS leaders never really operated out of Raqqa. Raqqa was always more of a symbolic capital for ISIS than a strategic capital. So the loss of Raqqa does not by any means mean the end of ISIS military capacity. It has lost administrative centers there, it has lost kind of courts, etc. But the leadership remains underground in the area between Iraq and Syria, and this area is very difficult to hold because it's a very rough terrain, and it's a desert, and they are underground. But what they will do is not stop fighting. Some fighters managed to kind of leave Raqqa quite swiftly because of deals conducted with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the main military entity that drove them out of Raqqa. Some of these fighters may not want to fight again, but a lot of them, as I said, have nowhere to go, and that's all they do. So it's likely that ISIS is going to stay with us in the form of an insurgency. So a bit similar to Al-Qaeda in Iraq when it was weakened and then kind of came back in the form of asymmetric opportunistic attacks. The other thing we have to remember is that ISIS so far has always compensated for loss of territory in Iraq and Syria through conducting opportunistic attacks around the world, and it is likely that we're going to see a continuation of this process. The other thing which not many people may know about or is not definitely talked about much is the link between ISIS and the regime. There is a definite connection between ISIS and the military intelligence within the Syrian regime in the form of conducting deals. And this also means that for the regime, it is in its interest for there to be an entity like ISIS, at the very least, in existence in Syria, because the regime narrative has not changed from the very beginning, which is that this is not about crushing an opposition and an uprising, but about fighting terrorism. So in a way, the regime needs some form of jihadist terrorism to continue to exist in Syria so that it can justify, first of all, its military activities, and second of all, present itself as a trusted partner to the West and appeal for cooperation and resources on the basis of fighting terrorism. And we saw this, by the way, before 2011, and I've spoken about this and written about this on a number of occasions. But for those of you who may not know, before 2011, the regime's military intelligence used to indirectly direct, if I can call it that, operatives belonging to Al-Qaeda to go into Iraq, conduct military and terrorist activities there, and then come back to Syria. And a lot of these operatives on the ground had no idea that they were ultimately reporting to the Syrian military intelligence. Nothing is black and white in this context. So this means that when it comes to dealing with reconstruction and dealing with the regime, it is very important to try to send resources to Syria, especially to civil society, but not through the regime. There are ways in which this can be done, and I think the international community should do this, and the same applies to humanitarian aid. The second issue, when it comes to ISIS, it is not enough to just talk about military eradication as a way to get rid of this group. You have to address the grievances, which of course takes us back to the elephant in the room, which is the issue of political transition. And the third thing that I will end with is the situation in Idlib. I am very concerned that the narrative about Idlib now is that it's a governorate under the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the group dominated by Jabhat Fath al-Sham, or what used to be known as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. This does not mean, just because this group is there, this does not mean that Idlib itself is 100% under the thumb of this organization. The organization mainly controls zones in Idlib through encircling them. And at the same time, it is not in control of administrative aspects of life in Idlib. There is a very strong process of civil resistance against HTS control of governance in Idlib, led by civil society. And sometimes I hear certain governments saying, funding to civil society in areas like Idlib should stop because the money may go into the wrong hands because of the existence of HTS. In fact, if that happens, HTS is going to take advantage of this and tell people, see how the West has let you down, and at the same time, it will not feel pressured to try to supply an alternative, because just like the regime only cares about loyalists, HTS only cares about the well-being of its own loyalists. It's not going to be driven to try to replace Western aid to civil society through kind of sending funding. If anything, stopping funding to civil society and local councils in Syria is going to drive people in the direction of HTS. And the fighting groups under the Free Syrian Army who are at risk of losing their funding from mainly the US completely at the end of the year, a lot of their fighters, not as factions, but a lot of the fighters will also try to seek alternatives. So again, when people talk about money going into the wrong hands and people getting radicalized, you have to understand that there are realities on the ground also to do with the livelihoods of people. And sometimes people are pushed to join whatever group is able to offer them funding just to make a living. So again, continuing funding for these entities in Syria is very important. There's a lot more to say, but I will stop here and thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lina. Very interesting. And finally, Alison, we're glad you were able to vote and make it to RUSI. We pride ourselves on our location, that we can make it convenient to do both within a short period of time. So tell us how it looks from your end of the road.
Oh, not that great is how it looks from the Houses of Parliament end of the road. Thank you very much to RUSI and to the IRC for asking me to speak this afternoon, and thank you to Lyse, to Yasmine and to Lina and to David for being an expert and brilliant. And in fact, there's a number of experts in the room who have spent a great deal of time helping me understand a little more about Syria. And as a parliamentarian, you know, you have to be a fast learner, but also rely on the expertise and wisdom of others. So my sincere thanks to all of those friends in the room who have worked with me over recent years. I'm not going to speak for too long because I know that people will want to contribute. But I just really want to focus, having heard the complex background, I just really want to focus on why I think that the UK government should still be engaging on Syria and what they could be doing in some sense to help. In all of the discussion about Syria in the House of Commons over the past year at least, and certainly around the siege of Aleppo, it has felt like the great challenge has been, for those of us who care about Syria, the great challenge has been to get the British government to engage in whatever means. And I would say that challenge is harder now, given the complexities of Brexit. Everybody will be aware of how that is absolutely dominating the UK government's agenda. But I still believe that despite the complexity of that challenge for our country, there are clear reasons for us to try and be involved in Syria. And I want to say what those reasons are. And first, let me just say that I think that the UK obviously must have a role in the future of Syria simply because of who we are. We're a permanent member of the Security Council, and we signed up along with hundreds of nations around the world to the responsibility to protect civilians. Jo Cox, at the time that she was killed, was writing a paper with my colleague Tom Tugendhat, who's now chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, called The Cost of Doing Nothing, that was precisely to reinvigorate this responsibility, to recognise that the cost of doing nothing must be factored in, just as the cost of doing something ought to be. And the British government has long accepted that responsibility and had it as part of the ideas that it signed up to, and I see no reason to give up on those ideas now. More importantly and crucially, we absolutely have the capacity to help people in this situation, and the fact of that capacity brings with it its own moral obligation. So, as I've said, I'm worried about the way that Syria seems to have completely dropped off the radar of UK politics. We had an urgent question on Raqqa yesterday, but notwithstanding that, I think it's clear that insufficient attention is being paid to Syria within British politics. So what could we do and what ought we to focus on? Now, we've heard a great deal, much more expert than my contribution will be, about some of the underlying issues in the conflict and the political complexities that are there. But I just want to focus on three things that I think we should push the British government specifically on aid, on accountability, and on refugees and internally displaced people. As we've heard, when it comes to the need for aid, the Assad regime have used starvation as a weapon of war, and that is utterly unacceptable and morally abhorrent. It is frankly medieval, and we cannot tolerate it. There are very many people currently living under siege from the Assad regime, and they are being slowly starved into submission, as we've already heard. And for me, this plays into that narrative. I think, Yasmine, you just said, the words, the propaganda will be, look how the West has let you down. And for me, that propaganda, the idea that we have let people down, that will be the biggest recruiting sergeant for whatever the extremist, terrorist, fundamentalist organizations are in the future, whether Daesh or ISIS continues, whatever happens, that idea that we have let people down will be the biggest propaganda slogan that they will have. So it is in fact agonizing for all of us who've advocated for the UK to open the path for aid, that the aid, be it medical aid or other crucial requirements, is there, it's nearby, it's in many cases in warehouses just a few miles away from those who need it. The barrier to that aid getting to those who need it is part logistical, part political, part security. But I think in those areas, the UK government has expertise in all of them. This is one of the things we do really well. So I think it's absolutely clear that even now, even after the failure of Aleppo, I think we should still retain an absolute clear focus on making the UK's resources work to get assistance to those who need it, especially those in the hardest to reach areas. And during the siege of Aleppo, I argued in the House of Commons to use airdrops to get aid in, if necessary. That was in some ways, controversial idea. And it's not actually, obviously, the best way to get that aid in. It's not at all without risk. But I stand by those arguments because I think we saw the consequences of the UK standing back and not having the confidence to act. At the time, I remember asking the Foreign Secretary, if you've got a better way to get aid to people who need it in Syria, tell me what it is and we'll support that instead. But until you can tell me, I'll still continue to call for aid drops. And I argued at the time that if we didn't act in Aleppo, that somewhere else would be next. And unfortunately, so it has come to pass. Now, the UK has one of the biggest humanitarian aid budgets in the world. I am very proud of that fact. And we know that there are plenty of other actors on the ground who have been working to provide urgent medical need and other things. And as I said, we have the capacity we have both the capacity and expertise to get the job done. So we need to, I think, keep focusing on requiring that of the British government. Secondly, on accountability, the actions of Russia at the Security Council this week were as disgraceful to me as they were unsurprising. We all know who has been using chemical weapons in Syria, and their blocking of the investigation shows that the Russian government know as well. But unfortunately for them, the fight for accountability for these war crimes doesn't end with one veto at the UN. And I think that there are steps that the UK government can ensure to take those responsible to make sure that those responsible do eventually face justice. Yasmine has already given us an excellent presentation, so I won't dwell on this issue, but the UK does have assets in the region that could be monitoring and recording atrocities for use in future investigations. No evidence will be a waste here. We don't know how long this will take, but I would implore the British government to make sure that they are straining every sinew to gather that evidence, and we could give the International Impartial and Independence Mechanism the funding that it needs to investigate these crimes. I think as a final point on accountability, We have to learn the lessons, and we need to take a very serious look here in Britain at our own processes in how we acknowledge and attend to early warnings of atrocities. I think that if we look at all of the moments of missed opportunities in relation to Syria, I think there are important lessons that the British government could adopt about how to collate, flag and escalate the signs of atrocities as they come early on, and make sure that those sat round the cabinet table are paying attention to things at the right stage, because we wouldn't then get into this point where after the fact we have to kind of have emergency debate after emergency debate and drag foreign secretaries and prime ministers to the dispatch box. The government itself should be paying attention to early warning signs. And again, the idea that international humanitarian law has been diminished, has been degraded, and has been discarded in Syria, for me, will be a threat to us all in the future, whether it's because it's as an argument that terrorists can make that, you know, what those in the international community say is just words rather than action, or whether it because it threatens us directly. I think we should all take very seriously what has happened to IHL. And finally, I just want to finish by talking about Syrian people, because since the conflict has begun, many millions of Syrians have been forced to flee their homes to avoid the conflict, and some of those have reached safety in other countries, such as the UK. I'm very sorry that we have not welcomed more refugees, but I'm very glad that we have welcomed some. But many are in camps still inside Syria, and they're unable to go home. And the crisis of internally displaced people is as much an international crisis, I think, as the refugee crisis that Europe is already obsessed by. And it will only be exacerbated, as has been said, by politicians in Europe just desperate to send people home. People think, oh, the sooner refugees are kind of off our hands, the better. But that's just absolutely unrealistic, because with towns in ruins, home destroyed, many people with no paperwork to prove their previous addresses, this conflict will just be absolutely exacerbated. It's simply no better to move people from camps in Turkey or Jordan to camps outside Homs or outside Aleppo. And looked at from a security perspective, you must reach the same conclusion, that it's vital for UK national security that we create some kind of stability for people in Syria rather than just transfer people from camp to camp. And the drain on resources will be unsustainable. Whilst we still have millions of people internally displaced in Syria, the country will not reach a sustainable point. And finally, I just want to say something about elections, because elections are absolutely crucial, but having participated in many, I feel at least an expert in that. And I know for a fact that elections by themselves do not equal democracy. It is the rules and conduct and participation of those elections that imply democracy. And I just look at the debate about Syria today and think to myself, where is civil society in this discussion? Where is the sense of fairness of who is heard? Because we won't deal with many of the long-standing issues of grievance, as has been said, until we take account of all in Syria, not just those who already have power. So I think we must make sure that, or at least attempt to make sure that Syrian people are enabled to go home under only the right conditions, when they have a home to go to, schools and hospitals to use, infrastructure, and in hope, in some time in the future, a government which wishes to keep them safe. In short, I wish for them a life to rebuild.
Thank you very much, Alison. And can I ask my RUSI colleagues to turn the lights on? It got really dark in here all of a sudden, so I can see people when we call on them for questions. So we have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 very interesting presentations by real experts with deep knowledge. It's probably very confusing for many of you if you don't follow Syria that closely, but it's an incredibly complex conflict, and it's been getting worse every year. The longer it drags out, the more complicated it gets. So don't feel bad if you find it confusing. Most people do. But let's take a few questions, and I'll ask the panelists to take notes, and then at the end we'll come to them. So let me start over here, and then you. Where's it? And then Hugh in the back. So let's start with that. Malcolm, please, and then, yeah, thank you in the front. Are there more lights to turn on? Sort of.
Yeah, they've got them on now.
Oh, okay.
Well, thanks for 5 marvellous presentations, very comprehensive. I wonder whether I could throw another element into the discussion. Over the last 3 years, in the war against Daesh, the Kurds in both Iraq and Syria have been the key Western allies and have played an absolutely vital role in both countries. But within weeks of the fall of Mosul and the virtual defeat, not quite, but virtual defeat of Daesh in Iraq, we've seen the Iraqi army pushing back the Kurds in Iraq and taking back much of the territory, and perhaps even, the report suggests today, taking some of the territory which has been part of Iraqi Kurdistan for a very long time. And what I would be interested in the panelists' view of is, as we come to the end of a territorial caliphate in Syria, what the position of the Syrian Kurds is, because their precedent set in Iraq, where the United States essentially has been neutral in the conflict between the Iraqi government and the Iraqi Kurds, suggests that now that ISIL is out of the way, and now that or not quite out of the way, but in large measure in terms of the territorial caliphate in Syria, will the West be neutral in a situation in which the Syrian government seeks to re-establish control of Raqqa and indeed all the way to Kobane? Arguably, in Syria, as in Iraq, the Kurds have overreached from areas which predominantly Kurdish settlement to areas of Arab settlement. Is that something in which we're going to be neutral, and what message does that send to future Western allies?
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
My name is Rahila Gupta, and I went to northern Syria last year to research a book on patriarchy, and I feel that is quite a big elephant in the room. I think Lyse Doucet referred to it in passing in terms of Kurdish self-rule. There is an amazing society that is taking hold in that area, based on gender equality, based on racial inclusivity, and despite their long history of being discriminated against by Arabs, the Kurdish majority in those areas have given up in their real democracy. We were talking about democracy, the kind of direct democracy that is being established there is just amazing. So in their parliament, their majlis, they have given up their own majority and have 10% quotas for Kurds, for Christians, and for Arabs. And so following on from what you're saying, it's absolutely the kind of, the reason why I became an activist, the reason why I presume, David, you went into politics, you know, this society which is based on all the values that we would want to see in our own country, here and all over the world. And they are a silent, because of the influence of Turkey and other players in the area, they're not on the Geneva peace talks, they're not in Astana, they've been completely invisibilized, and yet it is a possible template that could be established not just in Syria, not just in the Middle East, but I really think in the whole world. I know I sound passionate about this, but I really do feel very, very passionate about it.
Okay.
Anyway,
Thank you very much. Do you mind just give it to Ewan, please, and then the gentleman in the back of the room, and then the gentleman in the front of the room, and then you. Let's try that. Let's see how we go. Yeah. Go ahead, Ewan.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ewan Grant, former government intelligence analyst. My question is partly based on being in Jordan last month, where I was with the Syrian army the Jordanian army at the Syrian border, and it was, let's see, and it was very, very clear how dependent they currently still were on the FSA just across the border. And I noticed several points were made about the FSA. Is there anything going on imaginatively or behind the scenes to make use of the FSA, or indeed to preempt the risk, as was pointed out, that they may become guns for hire? Certainly, it seems there could be things behind the scenes with Russia, but also it strikes me that there's a potential foreign legion for the Arab countries if they can get their acts together and fund it, because Egypt's coming under increasing pressure, not just in the Sinai, but now in the Western Desert. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewan. So over there, here, and then Hugh, and then we'll stop. Sorry.
Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
I'm David Keane from LSE, and I've been working at Safer World as well. We've done a report about Syria. I just wanted anyway to say something briefly in support, in particular, of what Lina was saying, the importance of sustaining and giving aid to local councils, civil society, and not rushing to the conclusion that a particular terrorist group has taken over a particular area and dominates it. I think we saw with Aleppo, the dangers in, for example, United States officials coming out and saying al-Nusra is controlling Aleppo, and the kind of legitimacy that gave, spurious legitimacy to some of the Russian actions in particular. And I think, there is this danger of getting obsessed with the possibility that aid is going to fall into the hands of terrorist groups. But we have to recognize that these groups have got an awful lot of sources of funding in terms of foreign backers and oil, extortion. They don't necessarily need the aid. And of course, there's this parallel process that Lina was talking about, where over a period of years, people have become more and more disillusioned with the ability and the willingness of the West to provide protection and assistance. So if we want to actually look at the roots of terrorism, aid, I think, is part of the answer. This idea that aid should do no harm is completely unrealistic. There's so much harm that's done when aid is not given and cross-border relief is neglected and so on. And of course, because there is this relationship between the Assad regime and some of the terrorist groups, in particular ISIS, as long as those groups are nurtured, it's very much in the interests of the regime, and it's contributing to regime survival for the reasons that Lina in particular was giving. So I think it's also time to question this idea that we're still in a war on terror. We need to violently eliminate terrorist groups, because that really has been a stalking horse for all sorts of other kinds of violence by Russia, by Iran, by the regime, and I think even to some extent by the Kurds. So I think that's sort of a broader issue that's behind a lot of this as well.
Thank you, David. Sorry, I can't see you with the strobe light on my face over here.
I'm a member of the Institute. It's so complex, it's very hard to see how there can ever be, again, a government for Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so divided. Is it not realistic to say that whoever's in power in Damascus will never again control the whole country?
Yeah, great question. Can you just pass it back 2 rows? Oh, yeah, thank you. And then Hugh, and then we'll stop. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time.
Hi, my name is Sausan Abu Zainuddin, and I have a very specific question for Alison and Yasmine and the others if they would like. I know there's been a continuous effort to advocate for airdrops to besieged areas in Syria, and I know this has been responded to by a lack of political will, mostly justified by technical reasons, although practically this could be and is being challenged. But from both your experiences, how sustainable do you think that if we keep arguing for this, we would get a good reason on the ground. Like specifically now for Al-Ghouta, let's say, nearly 400,000 people are besieged and have started their campaign to pressure to act for this. But if we, let's say, succeed in convincing the government to do airdrops, and that's not systematic, it's going to be done then how do you see this effort? Would you see it? I don't want to say it's going in vain, but what actual results on the ground would do if we look in comparison to other things like, for example, specifically now I'm talking about this specific condition for Al-Ghouta, arguing for enforcing the conditions of the de-escalation zones, having the humanitarian corridors, letting the injured out, letting medical aid in, and breaking the siege basically in there.
Okay, thank you. And Hugh, be really brief, please, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hugh Ward, SARP Training Systems. How on earth do you think you are going to convince the electorate of liberal democracies that the governments across Europe and NATO know how to solve this problem? And if you don't, how can you expect them to actually suggest that you should be allowed to try?
Yeah, even though they've been trying for 7 years without success. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry to rush people, but we only just have a few minutes, and I know David has to get a plane. So Alison, why don't we start with you, and then we'll work out, just pick and choose what you want to answer.
Okay, I'm going to be really swift, because not least because those lights are making me quite warm. So, okay, so your question on the incapacities of liberal democracies, a subject with which I have much experience also. In the end, I mean, call me an idealist if you want, but didn't we sign up to the principles of international humanitarian law for a reason? And all I would like is, in the case of Syria, as in the case of every country everywhere, for those rules to be applied. Now, clearly, in the case of the Security Council, countries are exercising a veto. People have questioned how appropriate the use of that veto is and whether there's another method, and I suggest that we explore those other methods. In the end, I don't think it's for liberal democracies or any other country to tell Syrians what to do or who to elect or how to bring their country back together after this. I think that's for Syrian people to decide. I would just like the simple principle that when you engage in a war, there are still rules by which that activity is constrained. I would just like that principle to be upheld. It is as simple as that, for the reasons that I've explained. And on the question about, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Thank you. On the question of airdrops, sorry, perhaps didn't explain this very well. What we have always needed is a strategy to defend and protect and assist civilians. And airdrops, in my view, in the case of Aleppo, could have formed part of that. What we still need is an effective strategy to protect civilians. And in the situation that you mentioned, I think that the UK could certainly be a part of a group of people with international NGOs and others who worked to get necessary provisions to the people who need them. The problem is the UK government has chosen not to engage in doing so. So that's the simple challenge for me as a British politician, to try and make them do it. What the best means are and how we can make it not just a drop in the ocean and a one-off thing that goes nowhere. We can figure that out, I'm sure. But we have a simple challenge, and that is to get the British government to take steps forward and to take it as its job to protect civilians.
Thank you. Alison, Lina.
Three things. One, when it comes to the future role for the Free Syrian Army, there can definitely be a role for them, especially that we are in desperate need for locals to hold territory that is being liberated from ISIS. It will not work to have The Syrian Democratic Forces, for example, hold Raqqa after the liberation of Raqqa because they don't come from there. Meanwhile, areas in Deir ez-Zor, there are FSA factions coming from Deir ez-Zor that want to play a role as a police force, for example, in the governorate when ISIS is eradicated. So there can always be a role for these groups. It's just a matter for mainly the United States to have a plan to do so. And at the moment, unfortunately, I don't see this happening, but it should happen. We have to remember the conflict has become increasingly localized, and you need local trust for there to be stability in the interim period. The second thing I will talk about is the issue of women. Someone was commenting on the Kurds as being, you know, a kind of ideal example of inclusion when it comes to women, etc. I'm not denying that they're doing that, but we have to remember two things. One is that the Kurds in Syria, as they are in Iraq, are very pragmatic for obvious reasons, and they know that this will appeal to the West if they have women at the forefront, you know, in politics, in civil society, and even on the military front lines. So they have focused on this issue quite a lot in order to kind of present themselves in a positive light. So you're shaking your head. I know it is happening. I'm not denying it. I'm just saying they are amplifying it in the media, in their PR campaigns, in order to present themselves in this light. Now, can I continue? But what we shouldn't forget is that it is not just the Kurds who are having this prominent role for women in Syria. My concern is that we focus so much on the Kurds that we forget that across Syria, in areas like Idlib, even in Ghouta itself, there are women from all kinds of backgrounds who are doing exactly that, playing a prominent role in civil society, risking their lives to stand up to the jihadists as well as the regime and everybody else. And I know there are people in this room who work with these women, people who work with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, women with Women Now for Development, which is a great, great organization working on the ground. So don't just focus on one case and forget about the rest of the country. This brings me to my final point, which is about the Kurds themselves. Now, the Kurds as a minority have to be pragmatic in order to get more rights for themselves. And in Syria, they've been doing that. They are cooperating with the US against ISIS. They are on let's just say, communication terms with the Russians. But sadly for them, a lot of these foreign entities see them as tools, and it is not highly likely that they will get, at the end of the conflict, the autonomy that they hope for. Even the Syrian regime itself, that is now on relatively good terms with them to a certain extent, this relationship may not last. And this has been, sadly, the case for the Kurds throughout the history of this region, unfortunately. But the key thing is, when it comes to holding Arab territory, it's very important for these areas to have their own residents hold the territories, rather than, you know, hand this over to the Kurds just because they prove to be such loyal and reliable fighters in the liberation from ISIS campaign. Thank you.
Thank you for being brief. Sorry, everybody.
I'm going to be even briefer. My plane is at 8:05, so I think I'm living on the edge. 3 points. One, the future is local. The future is probably confederal at best, and I don't think that's a threat. I think that's something to be embraced. Personally, I wouldn't go into the. I think that's a much better option than starting to rewrite state boundaries. And actually, one of the most remarkable things: how many articles have been written about the breakup of the post-Ottoman settlement in the Middle East? Thousands. But what I find remarkable is how little challenge there is actually to the fundamental borders that are there. You're right that there are minorities who are persecuted in various parts of the region, but actually the future is going to be a confederal one, or it's going to be an anarchic one, and that's what we face. Secondly, I've seen, if we'd been having this meeting 3 weeks ago, and we talked about the Kurdish region of Iraq, and even if we talked about Kurds in Syria as well, we would have talked about them being much stronger than for a very long time. And I think that's a cautionary tale. I've seen the strengthening, not of the state, but of the society in the Kurdish region of Iraq. Interestingly enough, we do about 35% of our humanitarian work is in the Kurdish region, in Duhok and Sulaymaniyah and in Erbil, but actually 65% is in South and Central. But I've seen the strength of society there. I've seen extraordinary resilience, given that 250,000 Iraqis are there, 1.5 million, 250,000 Syrians, 1.5 million Iraqis have gone into the region. However, we all know that one of the distinguishing features of the Kurds has not just been their minority status, it's also been the divisions between them. And underneath what's happened in Kirkuk over the last couple of weeks, there's also a story of a house divided is a house weakened. We probably haven't got time to go into that now. Final point from Hugh Ward, which we think about a lot, because I have to spend a lot of my time trying to persuade people in liberal democracies, not necessarily voters these days, but people, that they should not just care about other parts of the world, but they can do something about it. And I think you set the bar too high when you say, can we persuade voters that it's their job to rewrite the constitution of Syria or make Syria Switzerland before we make Switzerland of ourselves, in more ways than one. But I do think that's to set the bar too high. I think we can set the bar in a different place, which is, have we learnt from our history that we either recognize interdependence, moral interdependence, but also strategic interdependence, or we suffer from the failure to manage it? And I think that the story of Syria is a story in which the costs of inaction have been very, very high indeed, and are very rarely calculated. They may be indirect, but they're nonetheless high. And as I think about the challenges of both policy and politics in the modern liberal democracy, what I see is, first of all, a historic argument that we make to voters. The fact that any refugees have rights anywhere in the world today is as a result of Western leadership after the Second World War, and they became universal rights only in 1967, interestingly. Secondly, I think there's an obvious moral argument that if you can see harm being done, and you have the ability to do something about it, but you don't, then it's not just sad, it's a crime. And I don't think we should be ashamed of making that argument. But the third argument is that in an interdependent world, someone else's problem is going to become your problem. And the old phrase that what starts in Syria doesn't end in Syria has been proved more than correct, and I feel that both morally as well as strategically. And I live in New York now, as you know, and the contrast that I see between President Trump's inaugural address on January the 20th and an article that you should read in Foreign Affairs in January 1957 by John F. Kennedy. He wrote after Eisenhower was re-elected, he went on a tour of 13 countries, and from Indonesia, Israel, and he took two lessons. One is that the move to independence, to what we call decolonization, is unstoppable, but the move to interdependence is also unstoppable. And he proposed in that article what then became a presidential speech in 1962, a declaration of interdependence. And there you see the two polar opposites. And in the 1957 article, a declaration of interdependence requires international cooperation with international institutions and international norms. And on the other, a zero-sum game, which is what I saw at the heart of President Trump's inaugural address. The JFK argument was a positive-sum game. And I think it's incredibly important, whether you're in politics or not, the hardest job, as Abraham Lincoln said, is to be a citizen. Whether you're in politics or not, is to make the argument that morally and historically and strategically, if we don't recognize the demands of interdependence, if we don't recognize that the blessings of globalization only come if you bear the burdens, then the burdens are going to get bigger. And I think that's a powerful argument that we mistake at our peril.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And let's just do a quick round of
Sorry
applause
to
to
leave.
thank David.
I'm really sorry
Thank
to
you
run
for
off.
coming, yeah. Before we turn to our final, we're not yet done, but just a few people are leaving. Thank you, David, and thank you to IRC for joining us on this. Okay, so Lyse, over to you. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a few quick points on the Kurds. I'm sure the Kurds are yet again reinforcing what has been their mantra, that the Kurds' only friends are the mountains, because they feel yet again that they've been let down. But I think what we've seen is, and I had the fortune or misfortune in the months leading up to the referendum of frequently being in places where I was talking to senior Kurdish officials who were insisting they wanted the referendum to go ahead, and senior officials from Baghdad saying the referendum must not go ahead. And as we know, the Kurds kept insisting that it was their right and they wanted to do it. They later found out that there was a deal on the table which was given too late by the United States, which would have been, you may have seen that, negotiations over a period of 2 years backed by the United States, and if they didn't succeed, then the Kurds would have the right then to try to seek some kind of autonomy or a referendum on independence. I think it was a very political move by Barzani. We now hear from Jalal Talimani's family that he did not want the referendum to go ahead. He felt it was a wrong move at the wrong time. David has hinted at the divisions among the Kurds, sadly, and that was his point of view, and so it goes to the heart of some of the divisions among the Kurds, notwithstanding the Kurds' right, of course, to seek what they have long sought. And we've just heard that Barzani and others have now said they will put aside the results of the referendum. So there's another attempt now to try to resolve this, to step back and to try to go toward negotiations. So perhaps something can be rescued from the process which keeps the Kurds' interests, but also the interests of Iraq intact. On women, I won't enter into the debate, but I'll suffice it to say that as a correspondent, Syria is one of the few places around the world where I regularly deal with women, leading women in the opposition, leading women on the government side. There are a lot of women in key places right across the Syrian conflict, and that includes, of course, the Kurdish situation. On aid drops, getting aid to people is such an urgent need because it's a war crime in a time of war to target civilians, and it's happening time and again. I'm not an aviation expert, but my understanding is that the big question is who will fly the planes? Who will give the planes? Britain and the United States will not give the planes and to fly so close to Damascus unless they speak to Russia, which controls the skies in the Syrian army. Whether or not the Syrian army would actually shoot them down is another question, but I think they would go to Russia and Russia would say no way, and that would cause them to hold back. I mean, it's a sad reality of the situation. We wish it was different, but I think it is you referred to technical reasons. There are technical reasons, but there are also political and security reasons why it hasn't happened yet. The World Food Programme had a hard time getting planes to drop in Deir ez-Zor, where the government said you must drop in Deir ez-Zor, where people are besieged by Islamic State. The only planes they could get, not surprisingly, were run by private Russian companies. So it's a hard reality. I'll just, Lina mentioned the role for the FSA. I think Jordan, which King Abdullah's hobby or one of his main pastimes is dashing back and forth to Washington to get enough money, enough support to hold up his tiny kingdom. And I think he will be rushing back and forth to plead with them that you cannot abandon the FSA. I cannot have insecurity on my border. And the United States, whoever's in power, has shown that it's ready to listen to Jordan's strategic concerns. It's one small little island in the midst of neighborhoods falling apart, stuck between Iraq and a hard place, as the king says. I think I'll leave it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and Yasmine, finally, thank you.
Okay, I know everyone's getting restless, so I'm going to limit it to 2 points. The first one on the role of the Free Syrian Army, I think it's already been discussed, but what I want to add is that we want to make sure we're not imposing any vision or any policy agenda on the Free Syrian Army, and I want to draw lessons from the U.S. Train and Equip program, which was implemented under the Obama administration, which sought to train and equip a group of so-called or branded moderate Syrian rebels, but stipulated on them the condition that they can't fight the Assad regime, which was a very naive way to approach the situation, given, if the U.S. had studied what these rebels actually want and what their aims are and how ISIS fits into their whole vision, they would have realized that it was very naive. So I think we, in our future discussions on the role of the Free Syrian Army, we need to remember that lesson. On the issue of aid drops, I completely agree that any effort to conduct aid drops by the UK or any other entity has to be credible, sustained, and enforceable. And that's what's been missing from any policy. So yes, you mentioned this idea of, let's say they conduct aid drop once and then they stop. And that's what happened, for example, in Khan Sheikhoun in April this year, where the US government launched airstrikes against a Syrian airbase. That hasn't been followed up by any other action, so the regime continues to use chemical weapons, although that strike was meant to, or supposedly meant to, act as a deterrent for the regime to employ chemical weapons. So it must be sustained, enforceable, and credible. But Additionally, what I want to mention is that the aid drops are not a solution for the humanitarian access issue. They are a means of inducing compliance by the regime. So it's basically a message of saying, so long as you continue to obstruct land access, we will conduct aid drops. And what we've seen in the past is that when the West or any other entity shows a willingness, a credible willingness to stand up to Assad's atrocities, we see the regime backing down. And here I can give the example of Ghouta in 2013, where all it took was a threat of intervention for Assad and its Russian ally to rush to the negotiating table, and that led ultimately to the adoption of Resolution 2118 on chemical weapons. It can be, maybe we might even find that a credible threat of conducting aid drops, although I wouldn't really perceive it as a threat. It's not like but maybe the credible demonstration that we will conduct aid drops might in itself be enough to open land access. Who knows, but it must be credible, sustained, and enforceable.
Thank you very much, and apologies to everyone for failing in my mission as a chair because we went over by 15 minutes, but you have to agree with me that it was such a rich conversation, and the expertise, we had a lot of great people at the table. So please join me in thanking the remaining panelists. Thank you very much.